History remembers King Charles III as a powerful reformer, a steady monarch who shaped modern Spain. But behind palace walls, a different story was unfolding: hidden whispers, silent terror, and a sickness no one dared name. Tonight you'll hear the version that never made it into the official records. In the spring of 1787, the royal palace of Madrid shimmered with familiar luxury: polished marble floors, candles burning in perfect alignment, servants moving in silent formation. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The empire appeared as stable as ever. But inside the king's private chambers, something invisible had already begun to spread. It started quietly, almost harmlessly. A faint discomfort in the throat, a slight hesitation when swallowing wine, a momentary pause during conversation. King Charles III dismissed it as fatigue. At his age, minor weakness was expected. He had ruled for decades, endured wars, reforms, betrayals, revolutions. What was a small ache compared to that? But the discomfort did not disappear. At formal dinners, attendants noticed he ate less. Not because of lack of hunger, but hesitation. He would lift his fork, then stop, blink, swallow hard. Continue as if nothing had happened. Nobles around him pretended not to notice. In the court of a king, silence was survival. Days passed. Then weeks. The king's voice began to change, no longer deep and controlled, but tense, restrained, as if every word required effort. His sleep became restless. Servants standing guard at night reported strange sounds from within the royal quarters: pacing footsteps, muffled prayers, occasional sharp coughs that echoed down the stone corridors. Still, officially, everything was fine, but the palace has a way of speaking, even when its people do not. Whispers began in the kitchens first, then in the servants' quarters, then among junior advisors who gathered in corners of the grand halls. Something is wrong with His Majesty. He eats alone now. He avoids the mirrors. He avoids the doctors, most frightening of all. He doesn't let anyone stand too close anymore. King Charles III, once known for discipline and structure, began to isolate himself. He shortened meetings, cancelled appearances, refused long conversations. When he did appear in public spaces, his posture was rigid and guarded, his hand often resting at the base of his throat, unconsciously shielding something he did not yet fully understand. By summer his temper shifted. A dropped goblet, a door closed too loudly, a whisper behind a curtain, all were suddenly interpreted as disrespect or conspiracy. His commands grew harsher, his patience shorter. Advisors who had guided him for years started to avoid prolonged contact. Servants walked on the softest part of the floor to dampen their footsteps. The palace felt coiled, like breath being held. One evening, during a gathering meant to reassure foreign envoys of Spain's strength, the illusion nearly shattered. King Charles III raised a glass to begin a diplomatic toast. The room went still, hundreds of eyes fixed on him. Yet instead of speaking, he froze, his expression tightening as if a hand had briefly gripped his throat from the inside. Only a moment. But in royal silence, a moment is everything. He forced a swallow, forced a smile, continued the toast. Those in the room applauded, but none of them forgot what they had seen. That night, the king ordered the curtains in his chamber sealed tightly, every draft blocked, every window shuttered. The air grew stale, heavy. Sacred objects were brought in. Religious figures were summoned. Candles were lit in increasing numbers. The king, once practical and rational, now surrounded himself with symbolic protection. Prayers were whispered near his bed. Holy water rested beside the door. Religious texts lay open, untouched, across his desk. Yet the discomfort only intensified. Days later, palace physicians were called quietly, discreetly, as if entering a crime scene rather than a royal chamber. They were not greeted with gratitude, but suspicion. Every question seemed to irritate him. Every instrument looked to him like a weapon. "What are you looking for?" he demanded. "Nothing, Your Majesty." "Only your comfort." "Then why do you examine me as if I am already dead?" No answer satisfied him. He dismissed them one by one. After that, he trusted no one. Instead, he invented rituals. Water had to be warmed a certain way. Servants had to rinse cups exactly 3 times. Handkerchiefs had to be replaced constantly. No one was allowed to cough in his presence. Anyone who did was escorted away immediately. Inside the palace, fear began to outweigh loyalty. And inside his own mind, fear had begun to take a darker shape. He suspected poison, conspiracy, foreign influence, divine punishment. At times he blamed enemies. At others, God. His once orderly thoughts fragmented under the weight of uncertainty. And the unseen presence at his throat continued to grow. By autumn of 1787, changes were visible even to outsiders. His face looked thinner, drawn. His eyes haunted, hollowed by restless nights, his clothing looser. Heavy collars now replaced by high, stiff coverings around his neck. Less of a fashion choice, more of a shield. Behind the fabric, something was undeniably changing. But the greatest horror wasn't physical, it was psychological. Because King Charles III did not see himself sick. He saw himself under attack, and the palace had become the battlefield. As winter approached, advisors understood the terrifying truth. Their king was no longer simply ill. He was fighting something only he could feel, only he could hear, only he could understand. And in the silence between his gasps of breath and whispered prayers, one question hung over the royal palace of Madrid. By the time winter wrapped itself around the kingdom, the palace no longer felt like the heart of power. It felt more like the lungs of a dying giant inhaling cold, exhaling fear that crept through every corridor and stone passage. Servants who had walked these halls their entire lives now moved more slowly, their steps careful and deliberate. They were not afraid of being seen. They were afraid of being heard. The chandeliers still gleamed, the marble floors still shone, and the tapestries still told stories of glory. But behind the beauty, a heavy stillness had taken root, as if the walls themselves waited for something terrible to happen. The king had not been seen in weeks. And when a ruler disappears, imagination fills the empty space faster than truth ever could. At first, the council reassured each other that it was a retreat of the mind and spirit, a sacred withdrawal meant to strengthen the crown. But silence has a way of growing teeth, and this silence had begun to bite. Whispers slithered through the palace like cold drafts creeping beneath locked doors. Some said the king had grown paranoid of invasion. Others claimed he had seen something in a dream that shattered his sanity. A few dared to speak of darker things, of curses hidden within ancient bloodlines. But no one dared say such things above a whisper. Inside the king's private chambers, the world had become smaller than a prison cell. It was now only a narrow stretch of floor, dim candlelight, and an air thick with unseen threats. He no longer trusted the mirrors that once reflected his royal image. Every single one had been covered with heavy cloth, as if reflections themselves had turned into traitors. When he passed them, he turned his face away. Not because of age, not because of vanity, but because of recognition that terrified him. He had begun to believe that something else lived inside his reflection, something that moved when he did not. Even the furniture felt suspicious to him. Chairs were pulled into new positions, tables shifted repeatedly, as though shape and distance could ward off danger. At night, he refused to lay flat. He remained sitting upright, wrapped tightly in layers of fabric as if guarding against an invisible hand. Sleep no longer came easily, and when it did, it was filled with images of suffocation, hands around his throat, weight on his chest, eyes staring from the darkness. He would wake drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. Then he would whisper prayers into the silence that never answered him. Servants entered only when summoned, never unexpectedly. They kept their heads lowered and their steps light, afraid even the sound of their breathing might anger him. Every meal was inspected as if it were a potential murder weapon. The food was tasted by 2 men before it ever reached his lips. Even then he ate little. Fear twisted in his stomach tighter than hunger ever could. The only liquid he trusted was drawn before his eyes. And even then, his gaze followed the cup as if expecting it to betray him. Day by day he grew thinner, not just in body but in presence. The once commanding presence of a king had been replaced by something fragile and flickering. His mind, however, remained sharp enough to torture him with every passing thought. He began hearing things when the palace lay asleep. Faint movements, soft murmurs. Breathing that did not belong to any living man. Sometimes he spoke to whatever he believed hovered just outside his vision, not with anger, but with careful negotiation. "You cannot claim what I have earned," he whispered into the dark. "I was chosen, I was crowned. I was anointed." Silence always answered him. But in his mind, silence was not peace, it was waiting. The guards outside his chambers were replaced twice as often now. No one wanted the duty that placed them closest to his door. Some swore they heard him walking in the middle of the night when no one had entered. Others claimed they heard 2 voices instead of 1. None of them dared investigate. Inside government halls, disorder began to sprout. Ministers who once waited for his command now argued over direction. Foreign envoys grew suspicious, then uneasy, then openly concerned. A kingdom without a visible leader looked like easy prey. Letters were sent, parchments stacked, messengers dispatched, but all requests to see the king returned unanswered. In response, he began issuing commands through sealed notes. Strange orders that no longer followed political logic. Certain halls were forbidden to be entered. Certain colors were to be removed from public chambers. Candles in the east wing were reduced in number. Windows in the west were to remain open, even in freezing air. The palace staff obeyed, though none of it made sense. And slowly, the building itself began to feel like an extension of his fear. Religious figures were summoned from distant lands. Each brought a new prayer, a new ritual, a new symbol of supposed protection. Holy water lined the doorways. Sacred symbols were carved into wood and stone. Incense burned constantly, mixing with the smell of cold stone and aging fabric. The air grew heavy as if carrying invisible sins. Yet despite all of this effort, his condition did not improve. If anything, it deepened. There were moments when he would stand in the center of the chamber, shaking. His lips would move as if responding to something unheard. When attendants dared to look at him, they saw a man in dialogue with the unseen. And that sight alone chilled their blood. Once, he laughed without reason. It was not joy, it was not madness. It was recognition. "They think they've hidden it," he murmured to the empty room. "But I feel it inside the walls." No one understood what he meant, and they were too afraid to ask. His closest physician was called in again, summoned in the middle of the night. The man entered the chamber with a trembling heart. He found the king seated beneath candlelight, hands resting on trembling knees. His face was pale, his eyes darkened by endless nights without rest. What is happening to me? The king asked, his voice quiet but sharp. Do not lie to me like the others do. The physician examined him carefully. His pulse, his breath, his skin. His pupils, there was no clear sickness, no fever, no wound. No visible rot. Only the unmistakable signs of a man being slowly consumed by something he could not name. A war taking place inside his mind and body. I cannot see it, the physician admitted carefully. But I can see what it is doing to you. The king closed his eyes, breathing slowly. I feel it even when you cannot see it. He described a weight inside his chest, a tightening in his throat, a presence resting against his spine. A slow, creeping possession of his own body. The physician could offer no cure. And ignorance in that moment was more dangerous than any disease. As days turned into weeks, the king's voice grew softer. Not because he lacked strength, but because he no longer wished to be heard. His movements slowed to deliberate effort. Each step was measured as though he walked through invisible resistance. He spent long hours staring at nothing at all. Yet his eyes were filled with things no other person could see. Outside, snow covered the grounds, blanketing the palace in white silence. Inside, the same silence spread, heavier, darker, thick with dread. Candles burned through entire nights, protecting him from shadows that waited beyond light. And still, his eyes never relaxed. Sometimes, a tear slipped down his face without sound. Not from pain, but from understanding. He knew what was coming, even if no one else dared to say it. He was being claimed, slowly, gently, without mercy. He summoned members of his bloodline one final time. They stood before him in quiet horror. I want you to remember something, he told them. This was not done by war. Not by man, he paused, letting the candlelight flicker across his tired features. It was done by something you cannot see. No applause. No grand farewell. Only the sound of breathing in a room holding its final moments. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows like a warning. Winter howled as if mourning in advance. Inside, the king closed his eyes, not in surrender but in recognition. He had ruled an empire, but could not rule what lived unseen inside him. And in that fragile silence, the question ceased to be whether he would survive. The only question left was how quietly the end would arrive. The queen had not slept in days, and yet the world outside her chamber remained unaware, unchanged, cruelly ordinary. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting colored patterns along the cold stone floor. While inside her body, a silent war was being lost one cell at a time. No bells rang, no alarm sounded, and no servant dared whisper the truth, because in a kingdom built on appearance, truth was more dangerous than any disease. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy goblet, the gold around its rim glinting as if mocking her slow decay. The wine inside no longer tasted of fruit or celebration. It tasted like iron, rot, and memory, like the echo of every secret she had ever swallowed. The maid said it was simply a fever, a passing sickness, nothing worthy of panic. But her reflection in the polished metal betrayed a far more terrifying reality. Dark circles clung to her eyes as if they had taken permanent residence, and her once rosy skin now pulled tight over her cheekbones like fragile parchment. Beneath the careful layers of powder and perfume, a faint, sickly scent lingered, something foreign, something that did not belong in a living body. Still, the court musicians played each evening, their melodies floating through corridors that could not carry the truth. Outside her doors, the ministers continued to argue about land, alliances, and wars they were eager to wage. They spoke her name with respect in public and exhaustion in private. Never daring to admit that the power holding the crown together was beginning to rot. A kingdom, after all, survives on illusion, and the strongest illusion of all is the belief that its ruler is untouchable. She had changed the world once through will alone, bending traditions that had existed for centuries, carving new laws where old ones had been locked in stone. Now, she could barely lift her own body from the silk-covered mattress that once felt like a throne and now felt like a coffin in disguise. How quietly power fades, she realized, how gracefully the world prepares itself to move on. In the hall below, nobles laughed over roasted meats and sugared fruit, unaware that the woman whose name blessed every coin and banner was fighting to draw each breath. The chandeliers flickered gently above their heads, casting warm light over a gathering that should have been a celebration of life. Instead, it marked the slow, invisible death of an era, happening just one floor above. Late at night, when silence pressed against the stone walls, she felt the true weight of her condition. Pain no longer came in sharp waves, but in deep, constant pressure, as if something had settled inside her and claimed ownership. It whispered through her veins, burned behind her ribs, and wrapped around her heart with relentless patience. Physicians came and went, their hands clean, their minds confused, their mouths full of comforting lies they had practiced since childhood. They examined her tongue, her eyes, the strange markings blooming beneath her skin, and each time turned away with carefully measured words. What good is knowledge, after all, when serving it would mean signing one's own death warrant? She began to sense that this had never truly been about illness at all. Something else lingered beneath the symptoms, something colder, deliberate, ancient. A truth that had been seeded long ago, perhaps in a political agreement. A rival's prayer, or a cup that should never have touched her lips? Memory became a dangerous companion during these final days. She remembered the night of the great feast, the way the torches flared higher than usual, the the smiles that waited too long at the corners of certain mouths. She remembered a hand brushing hers as a goblet was switched, a whisper lost beneath music, a glance that was held just 1 second longer than it should have been. In her sickness, images returned sharper than reality itself. Faces that had once bowed now wore expressions twisted with unreadable intent. Allies appeared as strangers and enemies as shadows that had patiently waited for their time to step forward. In the end, it was not fear of death that consumed her, but the unbearable question of who had truly placed the knife. The walls of the palace had always been thick with secrets, but now they felt alive with them. Every stone seemed to hum with concealed conversations and plots left unfinished. She wondered how many others had walked these same corridors believing in loyalty, unaware they were already stepping into history's trap. As her strength faded, so did the illusion of royalty. Without the crown placed on her brow, without the gowns layered in silk, she became simply a woman broken by time and betrayal. There was no ceremony in that realization, only the slow acceptance that power had always been temporary. On the final evening, the air itself felt heavy, as though it understood what no one dared to say. Candles burned low around her chamber, their flames trembling as if they sensed the approaching silence. Even the guards stationed outside her door stood unusually still, haunted by an unspoken awareness. She asked for no priest, no final proclamation to the people she once ruled. There were no declarations of glory or rehearsed last words meant for history's ink. Instead, she stared at the ceiling where painted angels watched in endless flight, and wondered if they too had ever known betrayal. When dawn finally touched the horizon, it did not enter the room with triumph. It crept in stolen and pale, as if ashamed to witness what lay upon the royal bed. The world continued breathing, birds singing, markets preparing to open, utterly indifferent to the end of a woman who once shaped its fate. Her name would be spoken, of course, carved into stone for future generations to admire. History would praise her victories, write poems of her influence, teach children of her ambition and grace. But the truth of her final hours, the slow, consuming infection, the silent murder masked as sickness, would be carefully erased. Scrolls were edited in the following weeks, testimonies destroyed, and servants sworn into eternal silence. The palace returned to its polished perfection, as if decay had never touched its heart. The throne would be occupied again, the crown worn by another head, and the kingdom would carry on as it always had, pretending nothing had ever happened. Yet stories do not vanish so easily. They seep into wood and stone, into the breath of those who walk the halls after midnight. Even now, it is said that the air grows cold beside the old chamber, that unseen footsteps echo where no living body stands, and that a faint scent of decay still clings to the royal curtains. Perhaps her spirit never left. Perhaps it lingers, bound to the secret too terrible to be spoken. Or perhaps the real haunting belongs not to her but to the living, to those who participated, who remained silent, who chose power over truth. Because in the end, the infection did more than kill a queen. It revealed an entire world corrupted from within, a court that smiled while death bloomed beneath its feet. And that is the secret history tried its hardest to bury. But secrets have a way of surviving. And now, after more than 500 years, you have heard it.